a teenage Roman girl named Saint Prisca became one of Christianity's earliest martyrs, so feared for her refusal to worship the pagan gods that later tradition says they threw her to a lion, and Rome still keeps her name alive on the Aventine Hill every January 18th. Her story is simple in its message and complicated in its details because the sources mix history with legend. What we can say with confidence is that Christians in Rome honored a martyr named Prisca very early. They honored her so persistently that a church on the Aventine Hill still bears her name today. And they remembered her on the same date, January 18th, for centuries in the liturgical memory of the city. Prisca is often called Priscilla because the names were closely related in Latin usage. That similarity created centuries of confusion with other women named Prisca or Priscilla in early Christian Rome. One of those names belongs to Priscilla, the wife of Aquila, who worked with Saint Paul in the New Testament. Most scholars do not identify Saint Prisca the martyr with Paul's co-worker, despite the tempting name overlap. The Church itself cautions against making that identification too confidently, because the evidence is thin. So, who was Saint Prisca? The strongest historical anchor is not a biography, but a place and a cult. There is an ancient titulus church in Rome called Saint Prisca on the Aventine. That title church is attested in the late 5th century as the Titulus Priscae. The present building is later and heavily rebuilt, but it preserves the memory of an older Christian meeting place. Tradition claims that this was once a house used for Christian worship in the earliest generations. Archaeology adds another layer to the story that fits the time and the city. Under the church, there is evidence of earlier Roman religious life, including a Mithraic sanctuary on the site. That detail matters because it shows how Christian Rome often rose directly over pagan Rome. The Aventine Hill, looking over the Tiber, was a natural neighborhood for old families, soldiers, and merchants. It was also a place where the early church established stable communities around house churches. The second anchor is a tomb. Ancient itineraries to the Roman martyrs in the 7th century mention a martyr named Prisca or Priscilla. They locate her grave in the catacomb of Priscilla on the Via Salaria. The Martyrologium Hieronymianum also notes a martyr, Priscilla, on that road, which matches the catacomb tradition. This is why historians think the real Prisca was a Roman martyr, venerated at a specific burial site. Between those two anchors, a church on the Aventine and a tomb on the Via Salaria, a picture emerges. A Christian community in Rome remembered a martyr and associated her with a house, a titled church, and a burial. Over time, legends tried to connect these separate memories into a single dramatic narrative. Those legends are not useless because they show what Christians valued and what they wanted to proclaim. But they must be handled carefully because they cannot be verified like a dated inscription. The popular legend begins with a noble Roman girl. It says she was raised in a Christian household and chose Christ decisively as a child. Some versions claim she was baptized by St. Peter himself when she was about 13. That detail is impossible to prove, yet it points to the Church's desire to link her to apostolic Rome. In the legend, she is ordered to sacrifice to pagan gods and refuses without hesitation. For that refusal, she is beaten, imprisoned, and pressured to deny her faith. Then the legend becomes symbolic and unforgettable. Prisca is brought into the amphitheater, where a lion is released to kill her. Instead of attacking, the lion lies down at her feet and will not harm her. The story echoes biblical themes, like Daniel in the lion's den, where God shows power through mercy. It also reflects how early Christians spoke about martyrdom as a victory, not a defeat. In the legend, the authorities respond with more torture and finally execution by the sword. Many sources attach a date to this martyrdom, but the dates vary and are uncertain. Some place her death in the 1st century, close to the Apostles. Others place it much later, even in the 3rd century during renewed imperial pressure on Christians. One later tradition ties her suffering to Emperor Claudius II, around the years 268 to 270. Still other accounts place her death around the year 275, which is also not securely documented. The honest conclusion is that Prisca's exact century is uncertain, even though her cult is ancient. This uncertainty is not a flaw in faith, but a reminder of how the early church remembered. Many Roman martyrs were known first by their names and their graves, not by detailed biographies. Communities gathered at those graves to pray, to celebrate the Eucharist, and to learn courage. Over generations, stories formed around those names, sometimes merging several people into one narrative. That is why scholars suspect that Prisca may reflect more than one early Roman Christian memory. Yet the Church continues to honor the witness that the name represents, even when details are obscure. So, what is Saint Prisca known for today? She is known as a virgin martyr, a young woman who preferred death to denying Christ. She is known as a sign that holiness is not postponed until old age. She is also known as a symbol of Rome's oldest Christian layers, where memory is carved into streets and stones. Her name is attached to the Santa Prisca Church, which is itself a living historical document. The church has been rebuilt, restored, and decorated, but the dedication keeps the saint present in the city. If you visited Santa Prisca on the Aventine, you would be walking through many centuries at once. The church is recorded as a Roman titulus, meaning it was one of the foundational parish churches of Rome. Later reconstructions gave it a Baroque face, while retaining older columns within the interior. Tradition says her relics are preserved there, especially associated with the crypt altar. Art inside the church depicts the 2 key legends, her baptism by Peter and her martyrdom. These artworks are not proof of events, but they show how Rome chose to remember her. There is also a quiet catechesis in the geography of her memory. Her supposed tomb is connected to the Catacomb of Priscilla on the Via Salaria. Catacombs were not just hiding places, but cemeteries where Christians confessed resurrection. The very act of preserving a martyr's name in a burial itinerary is a testimony of communal love. It says, "We know where she rests, and we still pray as one body." That continuity is one of the strongest forms of evidence for an early cult. Now, about miracles. The Church does not have a dossier of medically investigated miracles for Saint Prisca like it does for modern canonizations. That is because ancient saints entered the calendar through long-standing veneration, not modern legal procedures. So there is no beatification date, no canonization ceremony, and no pope who declared her a saint in the modern sense. Her sainthood is older than those processes and is grounded in immemorial cultus and the witness of martyrdom. The miracle most associated with her is the legend of the lion, which represents God's protection of the innocent. Another miracle in tradition is her steadfast endurance through torture, which Christians interpret as grace at work. When you hear these stories, listen for their theological meaning, while remembering their historical uncertainty. There is also an important detail for Catholics who love precision. Because the historical record is limited, the modern general Roman calendar does not always give her a universal memorial. Instead, she is kept especially in the Roman martyrology and in local Roman devotion. That tells you something about how the Church balances history and piety. The Church refuses to invent certainty where evidence is lacking, but it does not erase ancient memory. Saint Prisca remains a real name, a real devotion, and a real invitation to fidelity. What might Prisca's life have looked like in the Rome that produced martyrs? Christians were a tiny minority, often misunderstood and sometimes hated. Refusing sacrifice to the gods was not merely a private choice, but a public challenge to Roman religious order. A young Christian woman of a noble family would have faced family pressure, social pressure, and legal pressure. Martyrdom, when it came, was not romantic, but brutal, humiliating, and designed to break resolve. And yet, the martyrs repeatedly showed that conscience can be stronger than the empire. Prisca's legend emphasizes youth because youth makes the witness sharper. A 13-year-old has no political power, no army, no wealth that can save her. All she has is a confession, Jesus is Lord, and the courage to refuse false worship. That is why her name became a teaching tool, especially for the young, across many centuries. Her memory says that faith is not merely inherited but personally chosen. It also says that the Church's heroes are not only scholars and rulers, but also children and hidden souls. When you step back, Saint Prisca teaches two lessons at once. She teaches courage under pressure because martyrdom is the extreme form of integrity. She also teaches humility about our sources because not every saint comes with a neat, modern biography. The Church can honor a martyr without turning her into a cinematic character. It can say, "We know enough," and leave the rest to God. In a culture obsessed with documentation, that restraint is itself a kind of wisdom. So, how should January 18th be lived by a Catholic today? First, remember that martyrdom begins long before blood in the daily refusal of compromise with falsehood. Second, ask for the grace of a clean conscience, because the martyrs did not die for vague ideals. They died for a concrete confession, the divinity of Christ and the truth of his Church. Third, consider praying for prisoners and for Christians under persecution, since Prisca is often invoked in that spirit. And finally, if you ever visit Rome, put Santa Prisca on your list because saints are also maps. January 18th also reminds us that Rome is not only a museum of empire, but a city baptized by witnesses. Under basilicas, under streets, and under ordinary homes, there are layers of prayer and sacrifice. Saint Prisca stands for that hidden continuity, the Church living inside history without being owned by it. Her story may not give you every date, but it gives you a clear challenge. Hold fast to Christ when the world asks you to bow. Saint Prisca, Virgin and Martyr, pray for us.